Hi everyone, how are you? Thanks for joining me on this edition of Office Hours, May 2023. We are talking all about Injinji Toesocks today. So let me share my screen. Okay, so Injinji Toesocks, quite common in hikers and runners. I'm sure many of your patients are using them. Perhaps you're even using them yourself. We recently started stocking Injinji Toesocks in the blister prevention online store, so I had to go through and choose our range because Injinji have a huge range and there's no way we were going to stock the lot of them. So it was a difficult task because the range is so huge. I mean, just looking at this little selection of socks, like how would you choose one from the other? They differ in several ways. Injinji provide 4 heights, mainly 3 heights. They're the crew, the mini crew, and the no show. And they also have this hidden one here. They come in obviously different colours and patterns. And I'd like to suggest that most of us, or at least our patients, choose their height. That is their personal preference, and then choose the colour or the pattern sock that they like the look of. But we're going to delve a little bit deeper and see if we can't get a bit more purposeful about our choices of Injinji sock. They are classed according to activity by Injinji: run, ultra run, trail, and sport are the main ones. They come in 4 different thicknesses and they have different fibre content, mainly either Coolmax or wool. So first things first. Which blisters are Toesocks good for? They are literally only good for interdigital blisters and or pinch blisters. They're really no different to any other sock for any other blister location. So it's just blisters between the toes and pinch blisters. That's an important point to make because a lot of our patients have they continue to get blisters under their toenails or on top of their toes or under their big toe. And they just don't get that there's only a specific subset of blisters that Injinji Toesocks are good for. How do they work? Let's get into the nitty-gritty. So they work potentially in 4 ways. Normally in the interdigital space, it's a skin-skin interface. But with Toesocks, we create additional frictional interfaces. So we have more pairs of materials. And every pair of materials has a specific coefficient of friction. And potentially one of these new interfaces has a lower coefficient of friction than the skin-skin interface. So we're turning a skin-skin interface into skin, sock, 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 skin. It also manages moisture. Normally it's skin on skin. There's nothing there to manage the moisture, but with 2 layers of sock between there, that sock will be doing something with the moisture. So there's a moisture management component. And then there's 2 mechanisms that are related to their cushioning, and that is the reduction of pressure and absorbing shear. So let's have a look at them on this chart of blister prevention mechanisms. So the additional interfaces that's here, that they are aimed at reducing the coefficient of friction. The moisture management, that is also here. It's all about trying to get a very dry skin, because we know dry skin has a lower friction level than moist skin. Whether it does or not, who knows? But at least it is probably a bit drier than not having anything in that skin-skin interface. And then the cushioning component reduces pressure and absorbs shear. Yeah, some of the material undergoes shear within itself, particularly the thicker socks, such that there's less shear that needs to happen within the skin. Pros and cons. Always a good idea to think about the pros and cons of every strategy that you recommend so that you know that you're making the right recommendations. The biggest plus to Injinji Toesocks is they provide some level of protection for every interdigital space. There's nothing else that does that. Not as a single change. So you change from a normal sock to an Injinji Toesock, all of a sudden we've got all those levels of protection. But the downsides are related to the upsides, basically. It means that we've got a lot more sock layers in the finite area of the toe box. So when we wear toe socks, we're actually adding 8 sock layers to the toe box area. If this person gets swelling, or they're doing an activity that swelling is a component, like long distance running or multi-day hiking, and then if they also have to have other preventions or treatments in place, let's say the toe sock didn't go far enough to preventing blisters, you need at least a dressing. We're adding even more bulk. So if we have a look at a toe sock, just looking at those extra 8 layers and what that actually looks like in real life, that's what it looks like. There's quite a lot more bulk there. Even if you squish it right down, it's still substantial. If you don't have a toe sock, just get a sock out of your sock drawer, fold it over once, fold it over twice, and you'll get an appreciation of those 8 layers of sock. Every time I think about toe socks and the room they take up in the toe box, I think back to this female runner from the Adelaide Ultramarathon in 2014. She had each toe taped with rock tape and wore Injinji Toesocks. It was a 6-day ultramarathon, and the shoe was just not wide enough to cope with all that. And so she had to cut open her shoe, which is not unusual in ultramarathon. They go to extreme lengths. So let's have a look at the way that we can choose, or that our patients are choosing toe socks. First of all, they'll probably choose the height that they prefer. I don't think this pertains too much to blister prevention, as long as it's keeping muck out of the sock from getting between the sock and the skin. I think as much of a muchness is down to personal preference. Then there's activity. So Injinji break their socks down into run, ultra run, trail, and sport, and a couple of other categories, but these are the main ones. They cater mostly to runners. There's very few sport, very few trail socks. There's a few ultra run, but mainly they are in the run category. And there's 2 fibers that they class their socks as, either wool, merino wool, or Coolmax. So the few socks that are made of wool, they're about 66 to 75% merino wool. The other components of the sock, in every sock, are nylon and lycra. So the lycra varies between 2 and 5%, and then the nylon will make up the difference between the lycra and the main component, which in this case is merino wool. By far, Coolmax is the predominant sock fiber used by Injinji Toesocks. And if we look at the activity classifications, I kind of expected there to be kind of a sweet spot in regard to Coolmax, and that pretty much every sock would have that sort of narrow range of Coolmax distribution in the sock, but they're actually really quite large differences. If we think about Coolmax being the most common fiber in Injinji and run socks being the most common classification, the run socks actually have the least amount of Coolmax, which is interesting. Now, I don't know why that is. I have sought clarification, any information as to how and why that is. But nothing's been forthcoming. And if you also think about the run socks, there's actually more nylon in them than Coolmax. So if we've got a 30% Coolmax and let's say a 5% lycra, that's 65% nylon. So it's actually more nylon. And yet if you compare that to the sports socks, it's it's deemed there to be more need for moisture wicking, I guess. That's all I can take from that. And the final classification is thickness. Now, this is what I thought I was going to be swayed by mostly in regard to choosing some Injinji socks for our store. These are the classifications that Injinji use. They're a bit wordy, so I've kind of, just for my own purposes, used these classifications. Ultra thin, thin, padded, and padded plus. The plus pertaining just to the toes. There are terry loops in the toes in addition to the padded construction throughout. If you think back to the important sock research that we have in regard to blister incidents, this was by Herring and Ritchie back in the early 1990s. They found that the thickness of the sock was more important than the fibre composition. I won't go into the details, but basically thick was better. And that's all we've got as an evidence base. That's all we've got to go on in terms of what's the best sock. So these are the socks that I've chosen to stock in our store. They're all the ones at the top there. The properties are down here. I'll just orientate you a little bit. The Ultra Run, they're all the ones with the padded toes, which is great because, you know, running a lot means that you need more protection, I guess, and therefore they're thicker, and we know thicker helps. However, it also means that there's a bit of a mismatch in regard to the swelling component that is inevitably a part of ultra running. So there's probably going to be a time at the beginning of the race when toe socks are a good idea, or at least these ultra run socks, and then maybe get back into a thinner sock later on, or just into a standard sock. The two wool ones here, there are more wool socks within Injinji, but we've just decided to stock these two. These are the sports. There's a couple of trail, not many trail, and the run are kind of interspersed. So thickness, I think, is the main thing to look at here. I really don't know what to make of this, the fibre content. Injinji have been around for a long time. They must know what they're doing. They would have had many iterations, testing, customer feedback to arrive at their, you know, the way the socks are composed. So you can only assume that the socks are successful in terms of comfort. And I don't know about blister prevention. I'm not sure that's their main focus, but we've got what we've got anyway in terms of fibres. The way I would deal with this would be, I would obviously choose the height of the sock. That's an easy way to narrow down the socks that you're going to choose. Then decide on whether you want thick or thin or somewhere in between. Make that decision. And whatever the fibre ended up being, perhaps you can make a choice, perhaps you can't, depending on what your requirements are for the other two categories. And if you're getting on well, or let's say you're not getting on well with a particular toe sock, let's say it's got a low Coolmax concentration, maybe go for a sports sock and see whether that's any better. So the more Coolmax we are assuming, the better the moisture management. And on the other side of the coin, if you're happy with a toe sock, it's performing really well for you, it's comfortable, you haven't been getting blisters, you want the same one, have a look at what is the composition of that sock, how thick is it, what's the Coolmax or wool concentration, and figure it out from there as to how to, as close as you can, get the same sock. My general advice in choosing socks is, well, for Injinji Toesocks, I've got to make sure my customer or my patient understands that they're only going to be better above a normal sock for interdigital and pinch blisters. I would advise thick is better than thin, but I'm completely aware of the fact that we might not be able to get a thick toe sock into a shoe, depending on the activity, depending on the individual. But even a very thin and ultra thin sock there's got to be some advantage to having those 2 layers of material between the toes. As long as it fits in the shoe, I would be happy to have a thin sock. More than anything, just get something that's comfortable. In terms of moisture management, Doug Ritchie and I were on Talisha's P3 podcast a little while ago, and we were having a discussion about what's the perfect sock, which is a very difficult question to answer. I'll refer you back to the P3 podcast, but Doug queries whether moisture wicking actually occurs in real life. Most moisture wicking research is in the laboratory, not in an in-shoe environment. And he suspects that wool actually performs better at moisture management. Who knows? It's a complicated little topic. And more than anything, if blisters continue, move on to something more specific to that blister's anatomical location. This is so important. It's the best way to be thinking about blisters. So if I had a patient and they were still getting blisters between their toes or pinch blisters, I would try and understand why. Why is it happening? Is the toe really adductor varus and the 4th toe is literally sitting on it and treading on it with every step? If that's the case, perhaps I'll try and tape it and derotate that adductor varus toe. Or perhaps I just need to hone in on one particular blister. I don't need protection between all the toes. It's just let's say the 5th toe, it's a really bad adductor varus toe. I just want to absorb as much shear as possible. You cannot go past a gel toe sleeve for that. There's some other things that you can read up upon here. Of course, always think about how the toes are moving. What's making the bones move in the toes? Because there are certain biomechanical interventions that we can use for toe blisters. Okay, I'm just going to share with you that chart. Bear with me. And in the meantime, you can read that definition of blisters. And there we go. I'll have that. I'll continue to share that for about a week, and then I'll probably take that offline. So get in touch if you want to see that again. Okay, let's get into the Q&A. Joanne asked about Injinji liners with waterproof socks. Well, yes, Injinji liners, go for it. If you've got the room in the shoe, the only reason you would wear waterproof socks is if there's going to be a severe waterlogging situation. For example, the Bibbulmun track in WA, when people start at the southern Albany end, just around Denmark, there's areas where you are literally knee-deep in water for hours at a time. I always recommend waterproof socks, and not for blisters. I'm talking about maceration. Maceration is to be avoided at all costs when you have to back it up the next day and back it up the next day, because you just can't when you have severe maceration. So if you've got to wear waterproof socks, go for it, but don't wear them if your feet are only going to get a little bit wet. I'd rather opt for some other blister prevention. With waterproof socks, I'm always thinking about maceration. With waterproof socks, water can't get in. At the same time, water can't get out. So if your feet sweat a lot and you do get kind of hot in waterproof socks, if it's a warm day especially, there'll be a lot of sweat. It won't escape. They say that it's permeable. The sock is permeable to gases. But if it's waterlogged on the outside of the sock, that moisture gradient is not favourable for water vapour to move from the inside out. So you're going to get a lot of perspiration stuck inside the sock. And an Injinji toe sock is a great idea for dealing with that moisture a bit, even if it's just for the short term. Hopefully it is just for the short term. Waterproof socks in themselves are very thick. So we've got to think about the fact that we are adding even more bulk by wearing a toe sock, even the ultra thin liner. Yeah, that basically sums up my ideas on the waterproof socks and the liners. Definitely good idea to deal with some moisture. Get them all off as soon as you can. You'll need a pair of shoes to change into because your shoes will be waterlogged. Therefore, if you just put a dry pair of socks on and put them in wet shoes, they're going to be wet. Basic stuff, but people don't think about these things. Sarah, Simone and Celia ask variations on a theme, Defence Force boot conditions and recommendations, how to prevent blisters in netballers and trail marathons. My thoughts are these are the wrong questions to ask. The more appropriate questions to ask first up to start on preventing blisters is to think about what is the best prevention for this blister location. From that, you'll have a list of things and you can choose and nuance those strategies according to the boots in the Defence Forces, netballers, trail marathons. At the end of the day, the best prevention for a blister is the best prevention for a blister no matter what you're doing. You may need to make a compromise for a particular situation, but you've got to at least start with the knowledge of what's the best thing for that blister location rather than starting at what is their activity. So there's no real answer to these questions, I'm afraid. I hope that helps. If you need a hand with this, Blister Prevention University is what this is all about. Jamie asked, multi-day running events, blisters drained or not drained? Well, I like to drain blisters because if they're running for days at a time, their blister is probably going to burst itself in an unclean environment, opening it up to infection. So I'd rather do that in a controlled environment. Putting to the side a person's general health, which of course we must consider, you also need to tell your participant that they need to look after that blister for the coming days. Just because you've lanced it now and dressed it doesn't mean it doesn't need anything else. They've got to monitor it. They've got to put betadine on again, another Band-Aid, and they're monitoring for infection. So they need the gear. They need to be able to do it themselves, and it's going to take several days to really do it properly. Another couple of things to think about are, even when you lance a blister with a scalpel and you've got a hole in that blister roof about, I don't know, 3-4 mils long, you'll be surprised at how quickly that seals over. So just because you've lanced it once doesn't mean you won't need to lance it later. But the best thing is to implement prevention. The prevention is the thing that negates the blister causing shear. That means that the blister won't refill and it won't get worse with time, and it will feel better straight away. So yes, it's important to, like, this question of draining or not draining, but in every treatment situation, always go for some sort of prevention as well, because that's how they get pain relief. That's how the blister can start healing, even though they've got to still be on it, and how the blister doesn't get worse. Some great questions from Marion to finish off. Do you find hydrocolloid plasters worsen de-roof blisters when running or hiking? When would you not use them? Yes, they definitely can. And do you know how they can? When we haven't implemented prevention. When we do nothing about the blister causing shear, the blister, I don't care what it's got on it, it's going to continue. It's going to get worse. So the whole point of a hydrocolloid plaster is that you leave it on for days at a time. Well, if you're hiking and if, let's say, it's a blister at the back of the heel and you do nothing to negate the blister causing shear, the whole reason behind it, then after an hour, you'll need to change that hydrocolloid, and that's just a complete waste of a hydrocolloid. You might as well be using a Band-Aid and changing that regularly, because they're a lot easier to deal with. But if you put a hydrocolloid on and you implement some really great prevention, then you can be sure that you're not making that blister get worse with time. Then a hydrocolloid is fine to use. But the thing is, a lot of people, in most situations, they don't have great prevention to implement. I do. When I go to the races, I have the best prevention, and I'm not afraid to use a hydrocolloid if I'm confident enough that we've reduced the blister causing shear. So that's the difference. The other thing that can make them worse, oh no, that's if it's, a lot of people use hydrocolloids on intact blisters and blisters with a torn roof. And when you peel that off, it just makes everything worse, because you often peel the whole roof of the blister off. Marion had another great question. Case studies on orthotics reducing blisters at the interphalangeal joint of the hallux. Yes, they do. I would say the best way to deal with a sub-hallux blister is to deal with the mechanics. So we are thinking of functional hallux limitus or structural hallux limitus. If it's structural, there's probably not much that you can do mechanics-wise, bone movement-wise. So we're thinking bone movement, this part of blister prevention. But the aim, if it is a functional hallux limitus, is we don't want that arch, we don't want that first metatarsal to dorsiflex. We want the hallux to be able to dorsiflex on the metatarsal, which means the metatarsal has to plantarflex. That is what facilitating the windlass mechanism is all about. So any orthotic modification, or even a non-orthotic thing like a heel lift, for example, anything that you can do to facilitate the windlass mechanism will get that first met head weight bearing and take a bit of the pressure off the subhallux. So that's it. All right, guys, I might wrap it up there. If you want to know more about blisters, head over to the pro site. That's pro.blister-prevention.com. First things first, sign up for the free CPD and go from there. You can have a look at Blister Prevention University in here and some other things. And if you have questions, let me know. I hope this has been helpful in regards to choosing Injinji Toesocks. I hope that you just understand the socks a little bit better. Not just understand more, but also understand what we don't know about how they work. But they definitely have a place in blister prevention, so much so that's why we're stocking them in our store. Any questions, let me know. And until next time, which is the first Wednesday of the month, I will see you in June. Many thanks. Bye now.